All right, this is the presentation backwards. I'll be asking questions as we go through to see who took in anything that I just showed you.
Thank you, Louise.
Okay, thanks so much, Cecile, and thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you, Kevin, for inviting me to speak at this user group. I'm not sure I've ever been to a QualiWare user group either. Oh, I did once when I was actually in Ottawa, in your old offices. So my name is Louise Harris. I am change management and enterprise architecture. I was the lead architect for eHealth in the province of British Columbia in the early 2000s. And then I switched into focusing a lot more on change management and ended up doing a PhD in change management, specifically in change design. And I'm going to share with you today some of the results of that research, and also a little bit of one of the stories of one of the organizations that I did my research in. The motivation behind my research and the motivation behind what I want to share with you this evening is dealing with the very common and difficult challenge of engaging people in designing a new service or program or technology change, whatever it is, that we as enterprise architects are involved in helping to bring about. And change management is evolving rapidly, and it's becoming, I think, reached a stage where companies are realizing that it's no good having a change management person to do the change stuff. In actual fact, all of us who are involved in designing change in any way, and especially those involved in enterprise architecture, have a very important role to play in enabling change. And the basis behind my research was, how can we bring more of an engineering mindset to designing change and bring more of a people change management mindset to enterprise architecture? And I want to talk specifically today about enterprise architecture at the top end, the beginning of your enterprise architecture. What do we design first? We need to design things for executives. We need to design models that help executives make decisions on scoping a new service, scoping program change, scoping a complete new way of working, using new technology. So that's what I'm going to use as my examples. But the principles that I'm going to explain to you in terms of what makes a good diagram and what makes a bad diagram, or not so good diagram, are applicable to all diagrams that you use to engage business users. All right, so let's get started. When we're thinking about what makes a really good diagram that's intuitive and useful to business users, there's 4 areas that we need to consider. First of all, the purpose of the diagram. Second of all, who is our audience? The profiles of our users. Third of all, communication theory. How does communication work? And how can we align our diagrams with communication theory? And then fourthly, visual cognition principles. How does our brain actually process visual information? And how can we leverage those processes in our brain? How can we leverage principles of visual cognition to make our diagrams a lot easier to read? So you may realize, any of you who have studied communication, these are actually 4 areas of communication as well. The purpose of your communication, the audience who's receiving your communication, some theory behind it, and principles for communication. And communication is central to enterprise architecture. So let's start with the why, the purpose of business diagrams. So there are 3 main purposes of business diagrams. one of those purposes is to enable a design thought process. And I'm sure many of you have been a part of this, and certainly, process diagrams are something that are used a lot, UML activity diagrams. We're trying to help our users, our audience, go through a structured thought process in designing something new, to clarify the purpose of what they're trying to do, the new thing, to collect relevant ideas, to explore the flow of how this new work is going to work, to discover relationships amongst all the things that we're designing, and also to enable drill down, so that that's a very important part of the design thought process, is to help people stay up at the top until they've got a good sense of scope before diving into the details. And those of you who are business analysts, I'm sure, have had that challenge often. The second use of a business diagram is to verify and refine the design. So we may have had a small group work on the design. Now we need to verify and refine it with a much broader group of people. So this is a slightly different objective. We're much more focused now on readability of the diagram. And so again, we want to be able to use business diagrams that define the value and outcomes of whatever business change it is that we're doing, define the scope and the impact. And you'll notice probably that these first two especially are often not done diagrammatically or done using ad hoc diagrams. Often a lot of this is buried in business design or business case documents and project management documents. I'm getting a lot of feedback from someone. I wonder, Cecile, if you're able to mute everyone.
Sure, I will go through that list and do that. Thanks, Louise.
Yeah. And then the third purpose of a business diagram is to communicate a finished design. So now we're at the point where we're ready to implement it, and we want people to understand what's going on, how to use it, how to be involved. And again, we can use diagrams to explain the purpose, the scope, and the impact, and also flow and behavior. One of the things that I particularly was interested in, coming from a change management perspective, was how can we model behavior change? Behavior is one of the big things that trips up change implementation. How can we actually model behavior change in a diagram so it's very clear to people, so we can help people go through the thought processes of figuring out how is behavior going to change, or how are people's actions and interactions going to change? Verifying and refining that, and then communicating those. So using business diagrams to do the full suite of enterprise architecture. So it's important to know what is the objective of your business diagram. Where does it fall in terms of, is it at the very high level of purpose, or are you kind of drilling down to resources? And where are you in the stage? Are you trying to enable a thought process, verify a design, or communicate a finished design? And often we use different tools for these three processes. Enabling a thought process, often we don't use a lot of diagrams. We may use a lot, do focus groups and flip charts and whiteboards and stuff, which are all useful, but a diagram can really help bring that together. So we're going to look at all three of these objectives today. So moving on now to who. So who is the audience? So we've got some different purposes, but within each purpose, we may also have different audiences. And it's really important to know your audience. So is your audience executive, management, or frontline, back office, people who are actually going to be doing the work? Because depending on who your audience is, their purpose in engaging with you is going to be different. And the amount of time they have to engage with you is going to be different. Their level of interest will be different. And the time that you have to actually capture their attention and to make explanations is going to be very short. So for executive, their main purpose is strategic decision. So when we have diagrams that are geared more at the executive level around purpose and scope, that's the point, is to enable strategic decision, not to show everything that may be involved or make sure all details are covered. Our diagrams need to focus on only that information that is relevant for enabling strategic decisions. That's what they're looking at for, is scope, overall scope or department scope. An executive generally doesn't want any more than 30 seconds of explanation of a diagram. If it takes you more than 30 seconds to explain the diagram to an executive, then you can do some work to improve that. And they will need about 1 to 2 minutes to comprehend it. And if it takes more than 1 to 2 minutes to comprehend it, it's going to be more difficult for you to engage with them. So this was the targets that we gave ourselves during the research when we were designing diagrams at the executive management and frontline level, was these timeframes. Could we get diagrams that would enable this level of the explanation and comprehension to happen this quickly? Because if we can, then it means the effort for people to engage with us is a lot less and we'll be a lot more successful. So know your audience. So now let's dig a little bit into theories around communication and cognition. And I'm not going to go, totally very deep into this, but it's important to understand that the theory gives you a basis for understanding the principles. So how does communication work? This was a theory created way back in 65, I think, talks about communication, and it's particularly relevant to enterprise architecture and any kind of diagramming. So essentially, communication is broken down into 4 stages. There is the sending stage and the receiving stage. And on the sending stage, whoever is trying to communicate has some kind of vision in their mind. They have ideas that they want to communicate. They need to envision it into something cohesive. But then we need to disassemble those pieces, those concepts, because when we have stuff in our mind, it's conceptual. We need to disassemble that and encode it somehow. So either we encode it in words or we encode it in symbols. And then the receiving end gets either a textual document or a diagram, let's say, in our case. They need to be able to decode it. So the receiving end needs to know the same code that the sending end used. And then once it's decoded into its pieces, the receiving end now needs to reassemble it in their mind and actually understand what is the message. What are the relationships between things? And so this theory explains to us why diagrams are so much more effective than text in designing business change, because business change is a whole lot of different things interacting: processes, technology, goals, people, resources. It's not linear, so it's very difficult to describe in text. Diagrams are ideal. However, just because we put something into a diagram doesn't mean that it's automatically easier to understand. There are a lot of things that can go wrong. So, for instance, there can be missing information. So when the envisioning is done and the disassembling, not everything is actually encoded. So there could be missing information. There can be different interpretations. So what the sender meant by the code is not what the receiver understands by the code. So we see this a lot, even in textual documents. People have different meanings for words. But also in diagrams, symbols can be interpreted differently. And then eventually, once it's decoded, there may be more gaps because certain information is just not noticed. So what's assembled is not everything that was deassembled. Certain information is just not noticed. And then to make things even worse, often there's noise, which is generally irrelevant information and irrelevant symbology or other visual presentation. So what we want to do when we're looking at designing a really good diagram is to figure out a way that, we reduce the missing information, we reduce different interpretations, and we make sure that the relevant information is noticed. So this gets back to knowing your audience that we talked to before. What's relevant to that audience will make sure that that information is easily noticed and reduce all the noise, the irrelevant information. So that's one aspect of improving it. The other aspect is just even the cognitive load of going through this disassembling and encoding process and then decoding and reassembling. It's a lot of work, and especially for textual information, but also for diagrams. And this is one of the major hindrances that we found to engaging people was the cognitive load for them to actually understand the information we were trying to present. And so I'll give you a story about this, and this is the story I'm going to share more with you, but one of the research projects that I did, it was a health authority was trying to redesign their general ward patient service and the way that they staffed it with doctors, because they weren't attached to a university, so they didn't have access to residents. They were trying to redesign that, and they'd had some focus groups, and everybody was supportive of the change. Like, it was broken right now. They had two hospitals, did it two different ways, and neither way worked, and it was broken. So everyone believed that. Everybody wanted to change. They had a couple of focus groups, done lots of stickies and whiteboarding and flip charts and all that stuff. The two facilitator designers, one was a management consultant and one was a clinical consultant. They had been told that the summary couldn't be more than 1 page. So they had done one double-sided page, written an extremely well-written textual summary of what was discussed. And remember, they're at the business case stage here. They were trying to put together a business case to get funding from government. And in order to do that, they needed to understand the scope and impact of the change so that they could have a good sense of the amount of effort and how much it was going to cost. So they were at the business case stage. And so they did this, 2-page, very, very dense information. And they sent it around to everybody who had involved. And remember, these were all motivated people, and nobody would give them any feedback. And nobody would take a phone call from them, and nobody would agree to have a meeting with them. And these are doctors, hospital administrators, mostly doctors and hospital administrators. And they couldn't get any traction with anybody, and it was very frustrating. Obviously, they couldn't go forward. And finally, one person said to them, well, we just don't have time to read this. And so I don't want to meet with you if I haven't read it. And it was 2 pages, and they didn't have time to read it. And that is very typical of healthcare, but not only healthcare. I'm sure many of you in your various organizations have encountered that as well. They just didn't have time to read it because there was so much. And those who did kind of look at it thought, oh, wow, this is going to take a lot of attention to dissect this, figure out what all the pieces are, and make sure that there's nothing missing. And we don't want to agree to anything where there might be something missing and we don't know. So they couldn't get any traction. So it was an ideal research project for me. So we took those 2 pages and we put it into 2 diagrams. So it's still 2 pages, but now it was diagrams. And I'll tell you more about that story as we go along. So back to cognitive load. So there are 2 types of cognitive load: intrinsic and extrinsic. Okay, so intrinsic is related to the complexity of the information that you need to understand. And extrinsic, so essentially the content. And extrinsic is related to the presentation of the information. So how is the presentation presented? So we want to be able to reduce these two types of cognitive load. And, obviously change is complex, and you don't want to simplify the complexity away, because then you're just going to have gaps. So there's a certain amount you can do to reduce the intrinsic load, and we'll look at that. But the biggest area where you can reduce load is the extrinsic, the visual presentation, and that's what we're going to spend most of our time on. So reducing the intrinsic cognitive load, essentially the way to do that, because we don't want to reduce the amount of information, is to break the content into chunks. And this is not a new concept, and many of you, I'm sure, have done this with process mapping, and we do this with IT system design. We have a high-level design, and then we drill down. So we break the content into chunks and drill down. From a cognitive point of view, 5 to 9 concepts per diagram, types of concepts. Don't have more than that on one diagram. Otherwise, it starts becoming too difficult to understand. Okay, clear and common terms at our language, and then the right level of detail for the diagram purpose. The second area where we can reduce cognitive load, our extrinsic, is to reduce the encoding, ambiguity, and noise. So in other words, make sure that the encoding, the way that the visual representations on our diagrams are incredibly clear, and to make sure that there's nothing that's not relevant to the purpose of the diagram and the audience. That's the noise. So let's look about breaking the content into chunks. And so I'm taking this from a full business design point of view. How do we break our content for doing, let's take this health authority, for example, they wanted to design a whole new service. How do we break this down into chunks? And so from a business perspective, right up at the front end, we can chunk it into why and who and what. And we use our who as our common thread between our chunks. So our why is, what are our change drivers, our goals, what's the value, what's the outcome, and then our what is, what are the capabilities, processes, resources, and behaviors. And within our whys and whats, we can actually drill down. So we can have a high level why and drill down our why to perhaps more of a stakeholder centric why. And we can have a high level what, say at the program level, and then drill down our high level what into our different services or our different processes. So this is just an example of what's the kind of content that you would want to have for a complete new service design or a service change, right? Why for who, what I talked about. We're going to look at what is a strategic value model, customer and stakeholder profiles, an incredibly powerful change management tool that also is amazing for soliciting requirements, critical requirements, and key risks and hindrances. And then again, looking at what for who, for why. So now we're looking at scoping, and let's use some diagrams to actually describe the scope rather than a project charter that has an in and out scope list. And then our more detailed what. And we'll show you some examples of that. Before I get on to that, I want to talk about the visual how. So this is kind of the nuts and bolts of how is visual cognition enabled and hindered. What makes a good diagram versus a bad diagram, assuming that you have the right amount of content for your audience and your purpose. Now let's look into the actual construction of your diagram. So if we look at the visual cognition process in the human brain, there are two aspects to processing a diagram. One is the perceptual processing, which is kind of like seeing the landscape, seeing the whole picture, seeing the page. And perceptual processing in our brain is automatic, it's parallel, and it's very, very fast. we can look at a map and we absorb a whole lot of information all at once. Then we have the cognitive processing, which is actually understanding the details. So we're now moving our attention to certain things. And this is a sequential process as we go through trying to understand detail. And so the key with a really good diagram to reduce cognitive load is, can we move some of these things from cognitive processing into perceptual processing? Because if we can, if we design our diagram and lay it out and use the right kind of visual representations that allows more of this cognitive processing to happen by the perceptual processing. So, I mean, think of it like, you know, in your computers, if, you know, they've doing things like moving more stuff to be processed by the graphics card because it's a lot faster than the CPU. So it's the same idea. Can we move more things to be processed by our brain's graphics card rather than our regular CPU? This is called cognitive offloading. And we can, and there are some really good principles for that. And these principles are called the physics of notations. And this was a framework that was created by a person from Australia, architect and conceptual modeler and consultant called Moody. And he did an incredible amount of research into cognitive processing and came up with 9 principles. I'm going to share six of them with you tonight on how can we reduce coding, ambiguity, and noise that enables us to move some of that processing in our brain from our sequential cognitive processing to our parallel perceptual processing. So the first principle is called semiotic clarity. And what that really means is make sure that you have one unique symbol for each concept. One of the big disadvantages of UML is that it does not do this. It uses a lot of rectangles to mean a lot of different things. BPMN does a much better job of this, but still has some challenges. The second principle is dual coding. So as much as possible, you know, avoid legends, avoid people having to, you know what things are. If a symbol is not intuitive, then as much as possible, try and group everything of that concept of that symbol together and label it. So say, these are the processes. This is the technology. So that's what dual coding means, as much as possible. Perceptual discrimination. So the more dimensions that you use to make your symbols unique, the more they stand out from each other and the easier they are to remember and distinguish. So a good rule of thumb is to use color and shape. Color diagrams are way easier to understand than black and white diagrams. Use color and shape as much as possible to distinguish your different types of concepts or symbols. And then the principle of visual expressiveness. Use spatial position and shading to identify relationships and groupings. So one of the things that we did in our research was we said, you know, at a high level, because we're doing business diagrams that are trying to show scope and purpose, motivation. Can we design these with no arrows? Okay, so that was one of the goals that we set ourselves with. Could we create diagrams that had no arrows? You could actually tell how things were related based by their spatial positioning, where they were next to each other or far apart or horizontally or vertically. Shading and how they were grouped. And I'll show you some examples of that. Then the fifth principle is called graphic economy. And that says, you know, not too many different types of symbols on one diagram. So about 6 for novices. And for those of you who've worked with BPMN, you've probably seen this. There's like BPMN simple and then BPMN complex that has a ton of different icons for all different types of events, etc. And if you get more than 6 different things on a diagram, then people who are not very familiar will start having trouble keeping all those things separate. And then the last one is semantic transparency. And this is where we can often fall down, and I've certainly seen this a lot when we become too creative with our diagrams, and we use all these cute symbols, but a lot of them actually aren't intuitive. It's not immediately obvious what that symbol means or what it's meant to represent. So it's really, really important if you do use icons that they are immediately obvious. You don't need a legend to understand what the icons are. And one of the things that have been found is that icons, if you are going to use things that aren't quite so obvious, icons are a lot harder to learn and remember than shapes. So for any concepts where you don't have obvious icons, don't use an icon, use a shape. Because it's a lot easier for people to remember a shape, and especially if you have dual coding so that they learn, okay, squares are this, chevrons are processes, whatever. That is semantic transparency. So I am going to show you now an example of a bad diagram. All right. This was a diagram that was meant to show the purpose and scope of a bunch of change for public transit. Now, when I was involved in the team that created this diagram, and we were very proud of it, and we thought it was a fantastic diagram. But our business users didn't really get it. So I'm going to ask you to put your thinking caps on now. Why is this a bad diagram? Please enter in the chat. What is wrong with this diagram? And be critical. What is wrong with this diagram? Yeah, way too much to read. I can see that.
You're getting some comments. Yep.
Yes, I am. Way too many concepts. Yeah, very small. Yeah, fonts are really small.
Tiny fonts.
And some of it, yeah. Color doesn't discriminate enough. Absolutely. That's the next one. Same shapes. Yes. Like there's rectangles all over the place. Yeah. It's overwhelming. It is definitely overwhelming. Like, yeah. Complexity is too high for one slide. Absolutely. Like there's just way too much on here. Is it obvious to you what is the purpose of this diagram?
The vision's up front, but
yeah, the ends are in gold.
It's Earl here. Looking at this, Elizabeth and I were just talking, like, it tries to encapsulate everything from mission, vision to goals and values, all under one slide. So instead of breaking this up as mission, vision, then expectations, goals, values, and then the capabilities to get there, they tried to put everything on one slide, and you can't actually read that at all.
nope.
No.
And if I was an executive, I would just turn around and say, I don't understand. I'd skip the page.
Yep.
You would. Like, there's no way I can take time to read this. And, you know, another thing that's missing on this, actually, there's no who on here. Like, there are no, like, there's a tiny little stakeholder diagram down there, but there's no who. We got stakeholder values, but like who? You know, who cares about the balanced budget?
Not only is there no who, there's no why. What is this for? Like,
yeah.
And if I'm
why
working
is
in
not
public
clear.
transit, I should know what the mission vision is. That's not a problem.
Yeah.
I should know what this is.
Yeah.
But what are you trying to convey? To go to your first question, I think you've asked, or first point you asked is, what are you trying to convey in your diagram? What are you trying to convey in your presentation?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Very unclear. The icons are not explained. Yeah, exactly, like a little flag, like a red flag. You know, what does that mean? I mean, I could think, okay, I could see like the goal. Yeah, that's like a target. So maybe that means goal, but yeah. Yeah, so like just about everything is wrong with this diagram. So that's good work, everyone. So it's a great diagram to show for this example because there is a ton of stuff wrong with it. But, everything that we've mentioned, I can, go back even and think of a lot of my other diagrams that, maybe weren't as complex, but often had 2, 3 of these things that you've all mentioned. So a lot of things wrong with this diagram. All right, so let's move on then. And the other thing is there's no flow. Like, where do I start looking? Do I look in the middle? Or do I start at the top? And how? I don't even know where to start with this diagram. There's no flow whatsoever. Yeah. Not everyone will understand this is a business meta model rep. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's move on. We talked about all of this, so we can see the only thing that this diagram does well is it has dual coding. It actually does label the different concepts. That's the only thing it does well, except for in the middle here. I'm actually not sure what these are. Something to do with the plan, I guess. Everything else it does really bad. Okay, so I want to show you now an example set of diagrams for scoping a business change initiative, which was what we were trying to do with that BC Transit diagram. We were trying to scope this change program, okay? And we tried to do it all in one diagram. So this is the example. This is the story that I am telling you about. So here is a diagram. We called this the strategic value model. And it explains, why do we want to do this change? And who's going to be involved in this change? And why would they be interested in this change? So have a look at this diagram. Can you tell me who's going to be part of this change? How long did it take you to figure that out? Is it easy to identify who's going to be part of this change? I'll type in the text. Yeah, pretty easy. Yeah, how long did it take you? Yeah. Pretty quick to tell who's going to be part of this change. For a health authority, and these are the key stakeholders. Why are we doing this change? So why are we doing this change? This is essentially all this diagram is talking about. We're doing this change to implement these opportunities, take advantage of an opportunity, solve these challenges, and achieve these goals. This is why the health authority is doing this change. Why should the stakeholders get involved in this change? This change should deliver this ideal experience to them. It should help them address these challenges. And ultimately, this is the value that they're going to get out of this change. Now, what's very, very interesting about this story was that the value, if you have a look at the value of this change, 3 of them are around patient discharge. There was actually very little in the original text about patient discharge. It was all about, we need to have a sustainable hospitalist program. That was the goal. And while we're at it, to do that and to change the way that we resource our hospitalists, it's going to change the way they interact with people. And there was a lot of distress around the whole way things were working right now anyways. And when we actually went through the process of putting this in a diagram, and it was actually by building the next diagram that I'm going to show you, when we went through that process, everybody realized that in actual fact, the biggest value for everyone was if they could solve the patient discharge problem. That would actually motivate everyone to get involved in this change. Whereas before, there actually wasn't a clear motivation for why the stakeholders should get involved in the change. There's a clear motivation for the health authority, and certainly there was a hope that the hospitalists would, their job satisfaction would be a lot improved, because the current situation was it was not working at all. But everybody else would need to make changes for this to work, and there was actually not any motivation for anybody else. They were supposed to somehow be willing to change for the sake of the hospitalist. So one of the things that we discovered in this is that in actual fact, designing, even though you go kind of chunk and drill in your diagrams, it will be iterative. So in actual fact, we really just started with our enterprise change drivers. That's all we had. We didn't have any of this. And then we went to the next diagram. But let's just talk a little bit about some of our principles. So semiotic clarity. So we are using rectangles for 2 different things here, but they are actually subtypes of the same concept. So the concept here is actually perception, experience, and challenges as perceived by these stakeholders. And so we use color to distinguish between our different perceptions. But we have a different symbol for value. We do have an icon for goals. The healthcare workers actually chose that icon, and it made sense to them, so we used it. And you notice we have no arrows. We use horizontal spatial relationships. So where things are placed horizontally. So we're actually very much using a grid pattern. We're using columns kind of shading to describe our different types of concepts. And we're using horizontal placing to say this is all related to this stakeholder. So we were able, in this diagram, to not have any arrows. And the reason that we wanted to not have any arrows is because arrows are actually very much an extraneous cognitive load. So they make the diagrams a lot busier, and you've got to try and figure out, well, what do those arrows mean? And do all the arrows mean the same thing, etc. So they reduce a lot of cognitive load if you have no arrows. Now, obviously, when you're doing detailed design with processes and that, you need arrows. But at a high level, when you're trying to engage senior management and executive, you can stay away from arrows. That's good. Okay. Anything else that anyone notices that works well with this diagram? You want to put in the chat. Okay. We'll go on to the next one. So here's our scope. Okay, so that was our value. So as one of you mentioned earlier, that that other diagram had way too much. So here's our scope. This is actually the scope of what's going to change. So again, we see we have actually a few more stakeholders in this list than we had on the other one. We have other people who are going to be impacted, but not significantly impacted. Okay, so we added nurses and hospital administration. We've done a drill down of our why. So whereas on the previous diagram, we kind of had this high-level value statement, in this diagram, we actually have what are the direct outcomes that these different stakeholders are going to receive that all contribute to that value. Okay, so a drill down on our why for our stakeholders. So these actually now become, you could call them design goals for when we're going to go to our, further on in our detailed layers of design. These direct outcomes are design goals. We need to make sure that however we design our new processes and our new everything, that they achieve these direct outcomes. Okay. This is certainly one of the things where I know I have experienced a lot of conflict. Is people get different ideas for design, and some of them are really cool ideas. And if you don't have a really strong reference point of design goals, then it becomes kind of a conflict or a game of who has the strongest opinion or who is most influential as to which way you go. And sometimes you end up with design conflicts. So this is setting our design goals. Very important for them in healthcare was the ability to actually measure that they achieve their design goals. Because if you can't measure it, it's perhaps not a useful design goal, because how would you know whether you've achieved it? So it was one of the areas that they knew they were very weak in, so they added that to their scope because they wanted to make sure that they were able to measure all of their outcomes, their design goals, and that they knew where they'd get the data from. So you can see that there's there's 3 indicators here where they don't know where they're going to get the data from. So they're going to have to think about that, and that maybe is going to have to be added to the scope of their change, is how are they going to get the data? Some of this data, all these surveys actually don't exist. So this all needs to become part of the scope of change, is actually collecting their data. So they hadn't even thought about that before. They didn't have that as part of their business case. How were they going to collect their data to measure whether or not they were achieving their objectives? So that's part of their scope. And then these are all, they like to use the term business activity. Some people like to use the term business capability. Some people use the term services. Some people use the term top level processes. Whatever is the term that fits the most, the best in your audience, in your organization. They called it business activities. So their focus was around the inpatient primary care, the hospitalist, but they realized that there's actually, once they consider all this information that they have to collect, and some of the supporting services that are probably going to be impacted, like scheduling, utilization optimization, quality improvement, and patient safety, that all of these were part of their scope of change. So they realized their scope of change was bigger than they anticipated by putting it in a diagram like this. The other thing that they decided they wanted to do, which was represented on this diagram, is that they wanted to involve patients and family in the quality improvement and patient safety, and also in the program evaluation. And this was something new for them. They hadn't done this before, but they were they're very big on this whole patient-centric care. And so now we're going to get patients involved in this. So that means program evaluation needs to be part of the scope of change. It would anyways, because they've got to evaluate all of this. But quality improvement and patient safety, they want to actually get patients involved as part of this change. So this business activity or process is also part of their scope. So this gave them a good sense of how big is this change. So again, if we look at our principles, we've got really good dual coding here. We've outlined what each of these are. We have icons, a couple of icons that are easily understandable, check marks and little head and shoulder peoples. We've got squares for our indicators, our tools where our data is coming from. Those are rectangles as well. They've got thicker borders. And then our business activities are these kind of oval things. We've got our 2 main goals up here. Okay, so again, is it easy to tell who's involved? Yeah. What is working well with this diagram? It's easy to tell who's involved. We may want to ask, how come nurses and hospital administration aren't on the strategic value? It's easy to tell what's the scope of activities, like all of them, not just the main one that you're focused on. Implied relationships are easy to find. Yeah. Okay, so again, we have no lines. No, it's not necessary at the executive level, at the scope level, to say, length of stay is going to measure timely discharge. and put an arrow there. You know, that level of detail is not necessary. Pretty easy to get a sense. Look at this, and say, yeah, we've got everything we need. Okay, so that's a scope. I'm going to show you a different scope one, just to give you a sense. So not everybody is that concerned about measures and indicators. This particular one was chronic disease. They were more concerned about the journey. So this was a 5-year program. And so they actually had a lot of sub-projects as part of their program. And so that was important with their scope. The other one was, you know, they weren't going to be having sub-projects. It was going to be one project. So this is a similar type of thing. It's the scope. We've got our stakeholders. This one, we had our outcomes way over here. It might be better to have, this was a much earlier one. In the research, we discovered it was better to have the outcomes like right next to the stakeholder, because generally that's what stakeholders look for first. Right? The way that business people will look at something is to see, where am I, what's in it for me, and how am I impacted? And then how do I fit into the big picture? Yeah, that's a good point, Christopher. This one was a much older one. We didn't actually, there's definitely some improvements that can be had to this one, certainly around the different fonts. And you know, these are solid, whereas the other ones weren't so dark. And also the other thing that's not so good about this one that makes it busy is see how we've got space in between our lanes of people, and we have all these lines. That actually starts making it look busier and more complicated. So we probably either should have these touching, yeah, or we could just have straight bars. We don't need to have squares. We've got a little bit of too much busyness in this one. Anything else people can say about this one that's good or not so great? Too many colors here, probably. They were trying to show what the different types of projects were, you know, whether it was more infrastructure or more people, but probably too much color. Yeah, don't understand the overlap in the blended colors. Yeah, that's not, you see, and that's really interesting because it's irrelevant in a sense. So they were trying to show that identity management infrastructure was a technology and a process. Orange was process. And no, you wouldn't know what those colors meant, right? So the colors here are actually visual noise, because some people will notice, oh, this color changes and no one others change. You know, why does that color change? Well, actually, it's irrelevant to the purpose of this diagram. So people trying to figure out trying to figure out irrelevant information is unnecessary cognitive load. So it's a really good one. Have to turn your head to read the capability. Yeah. Now that's a very interesting challenge, Deanna, because we had that on the other one as well. This one, it was sideways. We actually did try making this vertical. So we put all the stakeholders at the top. But it wasn't any easier to read. So if you have an idea for how to do these long capabilities across multiple stakeholders and not do the text sideways, let me know. Sophie, how would you illustrate the journey in a more optimal way? That's a great question, Sophie. Sophie, how would you define more optimal? What is not clear about this journey that you would like to see more clear? Yeah, more clear, less busy. Yeah. So definitely, if we shouldn't have had colors like this. These should have just been rectangles that were outlined like maybe gray rectangles, right? So no colors would have been a lot easier. We didn't need to have these ones sideways. Like if there's enough room to be able to have these the right way, and we could have had, you know, the pilot as a subset of this rollout. So we could have put all of this text horizontally. Hard to figure out when each project ends in the timeline. Yeah, that's true because we're overlapping. So if we, and so that's a good question, you know, is it really important to know when the project ends? If it is, then we need to have a better way of describing that. Probably not having filled in rectangles.
Hi, Sarah here.
Or,
Another point I would like to make, especially in the Government of Canada context, is
Yep.
with accessibility. So color, there's a lot of people who have issues with being colorblind or have issues identifying color. And if you have too much like you do here, you won't be able to capture their attention, or they will be confused. So you have to be very
Absolutely.
careful using color in a, especially in a Government of Canada context, maybe in the private sector, less so. But certainly
Yeah.
when we're building maps, we have to be very careful with the use of color and the quantity of color being used.
yes, that is a very, very good point. There's actually and maybe you guys use it, but there is a site where you can go and it shows you what different colors look like depending on different kinds of color blindness. It shows you what that would actually look like to someone who had that color blindness. So you can sort of test things out. So for people, for instance, like my father-in-law is red-green colorblind, which is very, very common. And everything is just shades from red to green, everything is just shades of brown. So it means that you need to make sure that you're not using red and green as distinguishing colors. You need to use, you know, green and blue.
The other thing I wanted to point out is most people would associate red with bad and green with good. So looking at this journey map,
Yeah.
would say, oh, year 4 is awesome. Year 1,
Yeah.
the IT infrastructure modernization, that's not good. Like that's
Yeah.
the quick
That's bad.
hit that you might get from an ADM who looks at a map and says red is bad, green is good.
Absolutely. And there's no, there's no obvious, this violates the kind of the semantic transparency. It's not obvious what these colors mean. So you're absolutely right. There should be no colors here at all. Yeah. Yeah. Red, amber, green dashboards. Yeah, that's a big one too. One of the things, and that's a great comment, Christopher, one of the things that you can use these diagrams for also is to give status updates. So for instance, on this one, as they were going along, they could give status updates to say, you know, we're finished this one. We still have a lot of work to do on this one. Or, these ones are going along fine and we're really behind on this one. And that's a very common thing to do. And Qualaware has that a feature with the health check to be able to put little objects. So rather than using red, green, and yellow circles or red, green, and yellow squares, one of the things that we did, I think we did it on the BC Transit one, was we used different shapes. So we used the stop sign shape. What's that? 6 sides for red, and we used the triangle with amber for warning, and then we used just kind of like a rectangle green for good. So again, if you can use shapes or textures, or light, medium, and dark is another way to do it. Check marks for bullet can be misinterpreted as done. That's a very fascinating, another fascinating one, Christopher. So in a sense, yes, done. Well, year five direct outcome, these all should be done, which was why they were happy with check marks. Now, check marks is an interesting thing because, and this may be more specific to healthcare, but in healthcare, there's a very big quality assurance program focus, which they use check marks. They use check marks for done, for complete, but also for, this is your list of things. So they use it for done and for complete, and then also for correct. And so check marks for outcomes, maybe not so great. Maybe we should be using goal icons. So again, in healthcare, they wanted to have the check marks. They like that a lot better than the goal because they felt the goal is that this is done. So if you are going to use an icon, and sometimes that's organization specific, right? As to whether it is obvious or not. So here is the third one. So we did a drill down. So if we go back to this one, so this is our overall program scope. And now we're going to drill down into inpatient primary care and show the scope of change for inpatient primary care. All right. So this one is a little more detailed because we are actually, we're not totally into process design yet, but inpatient primary care being a service or a business activity, we wanted to show what's the scope of change for that. So again, we have the who. Yeah, good point, Tammy. Why it's so important to know your audience. It is so important to know your audience. We have the who over on the left with our stakeholders. And then we've also added another couple of rows, clinical information and guidelines and constraints. So those of you who are familiar with the Burleson hexagon, we'll see some of that in here in terms of information and guidelines and constraints. Now, I want to ask you a question in terms of obvious. May not be obvious to you, but it was obvious to them. What's the technology? Can anyone tell me what on this diagram is the technology? So we had dual coding for everything except for technology.
Earl here, I'm going to guess Meditech because that's close as I can.
Yeah. So the reason, so we violated our dual coding here, right? With our purple rectangles for the technology. The reason that it was okay to do that was because these technologies were all completely obvious to them, right? They use Meditech every day. They use Entry Point every day, and the multidisciplinary team use CRMS every day. So as soon as they saw the label in it, they knew this was technology because they are so familiar with it. So there will be certain things where, again, this gets back to knowing your audience, right? It was actually really important in this diagram to show what technology was being used in which process, because remember I said to you that they discovered that their biggest value was sorting out their discharge process. So when we got to doing this diagram with them, we had a big challenge with their planned discharge, because when I read their text document, and it took me 2 hours to read those 2 pages and translate it into 2 diagrams, and there were actually still a lot of gaps. We probably had a lot of these actions weren't filled in. I had planned discharge here at the end. We didn't have this process at all. I had planned discharge at the end. And when what we did is, so I'll get back to the story. So we built these 2 diagrams, myself and the 2 consultants, and then they asked everyone, could we come and meet with you? We're going to show you a couple of diagrams. It's also part of a research project, so if you don't understand them, that's fine, right? We're trying to make everyone feel at ease. And we're only going to need, 15, 20 minutes of your time, and you don't have to read anything ahead. And so when they sent out that invitation, everybody agreed to meet with them. So we actually went out there, took a trip out there, and we spent 3 days, and we met with people, and we had between 10 minutes with some people, half an hour with some people, so not very much time. One person, the hospital administrator of one hospital, We had 15 minutes, her for 15 minutes, and she probably spent 7 of those minutes on the phone, answering questions. And each time she was able to come back to this diagram and give us some more information. So it was actually quite amazing to watch that. And so when they all looked at this diagram and saw they saw planned discharge was at the end, and they all said, well, planned discharge is supposed to start at the beginning, as soon as the patient is admitted. And that's our big problem, is it isn't. It's supposed to start at the beginning, and there'll be, you know, most of it is done at the beginning based on the diagnosis and everything. It's updated if something happens, and then at the end, it's finished off. And there's this new process that they decided we needed to put in here called Create and Communicate Discharge Summary, because half the time this actually wasn't happening, depending on who the hospitalist was and what hospital they were in. And that the biggest challenge for the patients was that, in fact, they didn't know when they were going to be discharged until the last minute. A lot of these patients were elderly patients, and they couldn't be discharged sometimes until there was appropriate resources at their home for them, you know, to be able to use, because they weren't fully recovered, etc. The multidisciplinary team, who are the physios, the occupational therapists, etc., they often weren't involved in the planned discharge process until the very end, and then they had to try and rent equipment for people, or arrange equipment rentals for people, and that ended up delaying people being discharged. Doctors didn't know people were being discharged, and so they were discharged and told to go see their doctor in 2 days, and the doctor was all booked up, didn't have any room for them, because he didn't know, she didn't know. Sometimes the doctor, she didn't even know the patient was in hospital. So when they went through this diagram, everybody kind of focused on this planned discharge process, and that was how that percolated up, that was their biggest issue. And if they could solve that challenge, then they were all in on this change. And so we went back and updated the strategic value model and put in all those challenges and values for people after actually reviewing these diagrams with them, in which we collected all that information. So anything that, and so of course the other thing they noticed was, look at this, they're using 3 different systems to do planned discharge. And in fact, nobody except the multidisciplinary team knew that CRMS was being used, which was why there was a lot of information gaps, because some stuff was being put in Meditech, and the multidisciplinary team were putting stuff in CRMS. So, issue here that needs to be resolved as part of the change is that they're using 3 different systems to plan the discharge, and they need to sort that out. Any comments on what works with this diagram, or what could be a little better? So for those of you who don't know anything about healthcare, some of you were actually able to guess what the technology was. Those who are in healthcare knew what it was right away. And as Tammy said again, good to know your audience. The check marks mean something different again. Very good point, Christopher. You're really picking up on this. This was actually an issue in my research, because as part of my research, I was actually trying to design this visual language, so a set of symbols and rules and methods and diagram layouts. And so as you can see, we're using check marks for actions when we used it for outcomes, and that totally violates this, you know, using one symbol or one icon for one concept completely violates that. Now it is on a different diagram, but when I brought it up with the healthcare people, to them, it was no issue at all. Like nobody saw that as a problem. They didn't see that as a problem. And so that was very fascinating. And I think it's because they use check marks a lot. So they use check marks for lists. They use check marks to, that something is done. They use check marks to indicate, whether they're regularly doing certain actions or not. That's part of their quality control. So they had no problem with check marks. But certainly, others might. So I think ultimately, it'd probably be better to have a different icon for outcomes. But they like the check marks. So again, know your audience. If they really like the check marks for two different things, it doesn't cause them any confusion, that's what they want, then just go with it. As much as possible, you want your business people to own these diagrams and to feel like it's theirs. Okay, so back to our story then. So we met with these people in 10 to 30 minutes. They identified, I think we had we started off with one guideline and constraint, which was the hospitalist position description, which of course was going to be new. People identified a whole bunch more, which hadn't come up in their focus groups. We pretty much had the clinical information already. I think we added discharge summaries. That was important. We rearranged some of these processes. Some of these processes were pulled down to the multidisciplinary team because multidisciplinary team actually hadn't, this is another thing that was interesting, multidisciplinary team hadn't been involved in the focus groups. It had been all physicians and the hospital administration, not the nurses either. And so when we met with the multidisciplinary team coordinator to review these diagrams, we had 15 minutes with her, and she added a whole bunch of information, which when we added it to the diagrams before we went and met with the rest of the people, it was like, oh yeah, okay, that's right, or oh, I didn't know that. So within 15 minutes, we were actually able to address a major gap. So we met with everybody, we got all of their input on the diagrams, we updated the diagrams, we actually just sent them the two. They weren't particularly interested in this one, but we sent them the two that we had worked through with them. So the consultants were more interested in this one, and I think this one will be a lot more useful when they actually get to their next stage of starting to deploy. So this one and this one, we worked through with them. So we sent it back to them. And then there was a steering committee meeting to go over what was going to be the scope and to discuss the business case, etc. And basically, it took them about 5 minutes to go through the diagrams and for everyone to agree that yes, what I said was on this diagram. And it was the first time, I think it was first time in the memory of the people on that steering committee. So there was 10 people on the steering committee, or 8 or 10, all but the chair had been part of our interviews, which the chair was the only one who hadn't been part of building these diagrams. And in that one steering committee meeting, it took them 5 minutes to go through those two diagrams and say, yes, everything that we said is on here, and we don't see any more gaps, and we feel confident that this is the scope, good to go. And so they signed off on it. And I think that was the first time in their living memory that they'd ever signed off on anything in one steering committee meeting. And the medical chief, I think he was the one who was the steering committee chair, made sense to him, and he understood the scope. He was able to understand the scope in the 5 minutes and be willing to agree to it. So there you go. So we now have them on a much better footing than they were before, even after their focus groups. Even if they had agreed to review and taken the time to review those text documents, we identified actually quite a lot of gaps and hidden risks by using these diagrams, and didn't take us much time to teach them. Yes, Tammy, fantastic. It's timely to present a flawed diagram so people have something to work against. Totally, totally. You know, we didn't try and fill all the gaps. We just presented it with the gaps. The initial ones actually had some question marks. And what was very interesting, from that, Tammy, actually, what was very interesting was this indicators, measures, and tools. When we gave this to people, I think we had like about 4 things on here because they really hadn't talked about it. And the consultant said they'd had a really hard time getting people to talk about how are they going to measure outcomes. But there was something about having blank things on your line, your horizontal space, that people didn't like. And they did. They looked at themselves. They looked and they went, oh, like you've got all these blank squares. And they came up with indicators like right away. So that was kind of interesting too. So that's very true, Tammy. So a good point to remember, when you want people to actually build these themselves, you don't need to come up with something that's perfect. And sometimes, even if you know that something is wrong, there are a couple of things that I knew were wrong, didn't make sense based on the text, but we just put it that way and let people say, you know what, that's wrong, and then tell us what's right. So very, very good point. That's a very, very valuable point to keep in mind always. Any other?
Hi, it's Earl here. I have a question for you.
Yes.
As I've been looking at this, and I'm seeing that there's something that's missing in my point of view, being a financial guy, is I don't see any cost-benefit analysis of trying to get patients out and discharged as quickly as possible after going through this whole process. Did they ever do a cost-benefit analysis of how much it costs prior to this, to the change and the seamless patient discharge?
So what they did have was, if I go back to this diagram, what they did have, so this little measure here, medically discharged ALC. So what this means is that the person is ready to leave, but they actually don't leave. They stay because of these other various reasons. So they had this data. Well, they think they have this data. As you can see, they actually don't have a little square saying where they're going to source this data from. So one of the hospitals was documenting this well, and the other hospital wasn't as clear how they were documenting it. So that's a very good question. That is actually what's going to be part of their scope, is that they're going to have to figure that out, because they can't do the cost benefit analysis until they have this data and know the date the person should have been discharged. Because that's the real data. I mean, you could do some trending data to see, are people staying, you know, is the average stay shorter? You could do some trending on that and then, you know, multiply that by the cost per patient per day in a hospital. But what they really wanted to see was this data. So, very good point.
And you could use the CBP, and you could use the CBP add-on to actually QualiWare add-on to actually cost your services.
Yes. Yeah.
I was going there somewhat.
There you go, Earl.
Yeah, no, I was going there in my head because I didn't see anybody looking at value metrics for how much a patient, like, so you improve patient flow and bed utilization. And then to me, I would say, okay, what is that in terms of dollar values that could be reinvested into either having more nurses or more specialists to treat more patients, and then you go through the cycle again, right? That's where I'm going anyways, but.
Yeah. No, and it's a very good question, and you know, I think it'd be really interesting. It's not something that I have done yet. Is how could you actually create some kind of diagram that shows some of the financial benefits? right? Because as you can see here, the Sustainable Hospitalist Program is sort of financial, but we're not really talking a lot about financial benefits in this value area. So how could we do that?
We're talking about patient discharge, and I would say that if you have a good, solid patient discharge, the likelihood of readmission because they were discharged early or not discharged with any proper support afterwards, it costs more. So I know that they're getting to the discharge, so basically patient safety. I was just wondering if they ever thought about what the cost is of discharging a patient early or misdischarging, and then the doctor doesn't know, or the community physician doesn't know. So that's where I was going in my head anyways. Sorry, numbers.
Yeah. Yeah, no, but you know what? I think that maybe on a diagram, it's a really good point, because I think it is an important thing. And so maybe in our indicators and measures, we could actually have some financial measures, right? So, because if you look at our measures, most of them aren't, so we've got readmission rates, right, and length of stay, which have costs associated with them. So maybe if we added another measure that was, length of stay, slash total cost and readmission, or we added some cost measures here.
Right.
If costing was something.
Right. It can be buried in hospital administration, because hospital administrations focus a lot on metrics in terms of dollars, because they go back to the government for asks for their budget, et cetera. And if you use or if you improve the patient flow and bed utilization, there should be costs there, hospital services, et cetera. But I just don't see it.
No, and I think that's a fantastic point, because I think the reason you don't see it is it wasn't high on their mind. And so for somebody like you, looking at this diagram, you don't see it. Immediately you can say, well, okay, so where are our financial metrics? Are we going to have any financial metrics, right, is a question you can ask. And if the steering committee is, well, yeah, actually that's a good idea, we should have some financial metrics. Okay, so what are they? Let's put them on this diagram, and where are we going to get the data from? And do we have to actually include, as part of our scope, some changes to get that data, or some processes to get that data? So I would say that's critical, and perhaps a diagram like this could help raise those questions. So that's a great example, actually. Thank you. Do you think that would work if you put financial indicators on here? Like, would that answer? That would be a useful way to answer that question?
I just think that part of your program's scope of patient-centric care and the discharge, I do see items here like readmission rates and experience measures, scheduling. They all impact from a financial point of view. Especially hospital administration. Now, they could have deliberately put that out of scope, saying, financial concerns aside, we're looking at patient care. So they may have excluded that explicitly, but I would be one asking that question. What are the cost benefit analysis of each one of your measures that you're doing, or your outcomes, and how does that improve finances? Because as I said earlier, if I can improve reduce readmission rates or improve patient discharge, then the hospital will be saving money, and then we can hire more nurses, and then again, patient level care. So your patient community is now getting more attention, either specialists or nurses, or inpatient care. When they come in, they can hire another person to go through and improve the flow. I'm sorry, I'm going back to a lean analysis here of a hospital here in Ottawa that did that month long, and have improved turnaround times and wait times tremendously.
Yeah.
And it all goes
So-
from looking at something like this and then
Yeah.
going, but finance is just one side. Obviously, patient safety and
Yeah.
employee satisfaction is another thing.
Yeah. So essentially probably we could add another metric here, or or maybe as part of this, that just talks about cost, admissions, discharge, readmissions, and potential cost savings. And I think putting that as having a financial metric right on, like, that would be the point of putting it on this scope diagram, is to say, yes, we are going to measure financial metrics. And if you don't have it on this diagram, then you're probably not going to. You're not going to include it as part of your scope, because you might need to have some processes around actually doing those measurements, right, if they're not done right now. So this is definitely an executive level document that can answer these kinds of executive level questions. So very great observation. And so before I move on, any other questions, observations on these sets of scoping diagrams?
Yes, on the program scope slide, I think it's the one before. Yeah, this one. Under under the business activity column, how come some elements are stretched out further into others, even though they technically fall into, for example, inpatient primary care takes up more area in the inpatients and families row versus others that are also in that row?
Right. That's a very good question. So I would suggest that the reason that they did that was because if it takes up the full row, then that stakeholder is a full participant in that process. The reason that these three don't take up the full row of the inpatient and families is because their thinking was, we've never involved inpatients in these processes before, and we want to start to get them involved. So we're going to involve them a little bit. Because they designed this, they knew that that's what that meant. But, and there was some political stuff around it, so that's what they did. Normally, I would say, make the activity just cover the whole, unless it's very important that that you're just going to involve them a little bit, or there's some particular reason. So that was the reason for that one. So the utilization optimization is fully a hospital administration process. The hospital administrators, they're partially involved in this process, in these processes. That was their logic, but it's a good question. Okay, time checks. Time for me to finish, I'm being told. So my very last slide. Thanks everyone. That was a really great interaction. So I just wanted to finish up with the fact that, as Kevin mentioned, we are putting together some training programs on this. They are, there's 4 modules that basically go through. Each module adds to the previous one to take you up a level on the change design maturity model. So the first one being Design for Value, which is the one Kevin mentioned, will be happening in May and June. And it's focused on that whole concept of the strategic value model. Also, the other diagram I told you about, which is the stakeholder change profile that we use a lot throughout the whole change management process. And also talks about, what is a human-centered change architecture and design framework, and what does it look like, how to put it together, etc. So it is blended learning, which means that it's online as well as live sessions, as well as having case studies and actual assignments that you do that I give you feedback on, and that you get to give each other feedback on. So we've been doing this for the Canadian Association of Management Consultants. I've added a bit more enterprise architecture to this for you guys. So that is on Close Reach's site. And I think everyone will get the slides and you can contact me. There's the URL for the training on Close Reach. And over to you, Kevin, and thank you everyone, and sorry that I went over.
That's okay. Very, very interesting discussion and lots of questions and comments and interactions. So thank you very much, Louise. Really, really appreciate it. And you taking the time to spend